Are we dealing with entirely different disease? That's what is the excitement all about. The complete scenario, almost every component of the disease entity has changed. Let's see. This is how I have arranged my lecture design. Next slide, please. Yeah, to start with a kind of a brief presentation about a case scenario, which a real-time case, which we had managed, and then pathomechanisms and the changing scenario almost in every aspect of the disease, and our own experience and publications and current uncertainties and challenges. Next slide. Yeah, here is a 61-year-old gentleman who is a weaver by occupation, who was a known diabetic for about 1.5 decades. He presented to us with a brief febrile illness spanning over a couple of weeks. Evaluation revealed an ulcer in the right leg. He was oliguric, and on evaluation, he was in renal failure. That's why he was referred to us from a physician. He was, next slide, yeah. He was anemic, edematous, blood pressure was 160/90 millimeter mercury, and he was tachypneic too. There was an ulcer in the right leg, but almost healed. Actually, there was no active focus of infection, at least from inspection wise. Next slide, please. This is the urinary analysis of that gentleman. 3+ proteinuria, 20 to 25 RBCs per hypofield. And the hero finding of urinalysis was RBC cost. And urine spot protein creatinine ratio was 3.12. Little digression about RBC cost. I may sound very basic, but I think this is very important. Whenever you come across RBC cost in a urine sediment, you have to be very, very certain, 100% certain that you are dealing with glomerulonephritis. Why is it so? RBC cost is equal to RBCs plus hyaline cost. Hyaline cost is nothing but a tubular mold of TAM phosphoprotein. This TAM phosphoprotein has got unique properties. One, it is a large molecular weight protein. It's a glycoprotein bar, mucoprotein. Number two, it has got a tendency for jellification. It just gets gelled up. Two, third point is that it is very sticky in nature. Whatever comes across its way will get stuck onto it. These facts about TAM phosphoprotein you have to remember. Then only you will understand the importance of RBC cost. So I said, what is the hyaline cost? It's nothing but the tubular mold of TAM phosphoprotein without anything. So hyaline cost usually it is physiological. You get it after strenuous exercise and profuse sweating and dehydration and acute febrile illness and so on. It is just TAM phosphoprotein. I said, whatever comes across its way will get stuck onto it, meaning something has to come proximal to its origin. It is this TAM phosphoprotein mold is formed in the medullary thick ascending Henle's loop. So RBC cost meaning RBC coming proximal to that. What is proximal? From glomerulus. So RBC cost almost always denotes there is glomerular inflammation. So am I clear? So this is what is the characteristic of a nephritic sediment. Of course, practically we any urine sediment with plenty of RBCs, we take it as a nephritic sediment. Of course, it's fine, but to be certain, either you have to demonstrate an RBC cost, or you should be able to demonstrate dysmorphic RBCs under phase contrast microscope. Then only you can be sure of the origin of the hematuria, right? Fine. And protein creatinine ratio 3.12, and the validity of this in the presence of renal failure is not that much. Fine, let us move on. There is evidence for infection in the sense that it's a polymorphonuclear leukocytosis, and he is anemia and elevated ESR. Next slide. Yeah, look at the biochemistry. Admission creatinine was 1.9, then moved on to, it rose to 3.8 milligram per deciliter. A significant renal failure, mild hyponatremia, acidosis, hypoalbuminemia. And look at ABG again. There is acidemia and metabolic acidosis. Very important finding here is that hypocomplementemia C3. The lab standard of a particular lab where it was done is 80 to 180 milligram per deciliter of C3. So there is hypocomplementemia C3. This is what is the picture. So what is a renal syndrome we are dealing with? It is acute kidney injury, and on top of it, acute nephritic syndrome. This is how we proceed. This is how the clinical approach of the nephrology differs from all other branches. We don't jump and make a diagnosis, etiological diagnosis. We first identify the renal syndrome, right? There can be presence of one or more syndromes, and then we narrow down the possibilities. Acute nephritic syndrome in this 61-year-old gentleman. We went ahead doing a kidney biopsy. So this is the next slide, and then please project the slide again back. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, fine. So look at this. It's a high power projection. Projecting. No, the previous slide. The previous slide. Hello. Yeah. Yes. So look at this. One glomerular is projected so well. It is hematoxylin eosin. See, there is no Bowman space, meaning there is extensive proliferation, and this proliferation is diffuse. This we call as diffuse proliferative glomerulonephritis, and this proliferation is contributed by endocapillary proliferation. Look at the capillary lumina. Almost every capillary lumen there is a cell, there is endothelial cell. If you carefully look into it, there is neutrophilic infiltration as well. There is influx of neutrophils, endocapillary proliferation, as well as mesangial proliferation, a classical diffuse proliferative glomerulonephritis. Please go back to the previous slide. Yeah. So just the slide before this. Next. Yeah, this one. 17 glomeruli were identified. There was diffuse endocapillary proliferation with polymorphonuclears, no crescents and no fibrinoid necrosis. We use the term exudative proliferative glomerulonephritis. When do we use the term exudative, adjective? When there is infiltration or influx of neutrophils, we call it as exudative. There are very few pathologies where you can demonstrate neutrophils in the glomerulus. One, you have it in infection-related glomerulonephritis, and also you can have it in class 4 lupus nephritis sometimes. It's not very prominent, you can get that. So, unless proved otherwise, an exudative proliferative glomerulonephritis, where there is significant presence of endocapillary proliferation along with neutrophils, usually it is in infection-related glomerulonephritis. Now you focus your attention on the immunofluorescence pattern. 3 plus C3 and IgG just 1 plus, a coarse granular positivity over capillary walls and mesangium. So it's predominantly C3, right? Next slide. Next slide. We went ahead doing electron microscopy, right? Nowadays, we realize the importance of electron microscopy. In most of the situations, without electron microscopy, our analysis is not complete. So that is the greatest advantage we have now for the past 1 decade, access to the facility of electron microscopy. Look at this here. See the yellow arrows. What do they demonstrate? They demonstrate the presence of deposits, subendothelial and intramembranous. So you have to learn to identify, you have to get familiar with interpretation of electron microscopic analysis. To start with, you just concentrate the capillary lumen and then proceed. Endothelium, then membrane, subendothelial space, and then membrane, and then subepithelial space. If you carefully look into it, the food processes can be seen, just anything adjacent process. Here it is a subendothelial as well as intramembranous deposits. Next slide, please. Now in this slide, the red arrows subendothelial and the yellow arrow, as you can see here, it is in the 7 o'clock position in the slide, 7 o'clock position in the slide. There is a hump, there is a rounded structure that is subepithelial space. So there is a subepithelial hump here. We do have subendothelial deposit here as well as subepithelial. Now, all these findings together, a diffuse proliferative glomerulonephritis in the light microscopy, essentially C3 alone, just trace IgG. So C3 dominance in immunofluorescence, and subepithelial hump along with subendothelial deposits in the electron microscopy. The diagnosis is infection-related glomerulonephritis. Next slide. The diagnosis is infection-related glomerulonephritis, IRGN. Next slide. As Professor P.P. Verma was alluding to, we all learned to start with as undergraduates in 1980s, post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis in pediatric subject. Then it became PIGN, post-infectious glomerulonephritis, because it became very evident that it is not just streptococcus. A host of so many other organisms can result in the same kind of pathology and the clinical picture. So to denote all organisms causing this syndrome, it was called as post-infectious glomerulonephritis. Why this post? Post meaning very often. What is the prototypic illness? Yes, a skin, a cutaneous infection or an upper respiratory infection, classically a pharyngitis, followed by the glomerulonephritis. There is a distinct gap after the occurrence of the infection and then onset of the glomerular illness, a classical phenomenon of post, meaning most of the times, by the time you come across the glomerulonephritis, the infection would have already subsided. This kind of a distinctive pattern of the glomerulonephritis happening after a latent period of the infection. That was the classical scenario. So it was called post-infectious glomerulonephritis. Later on, what happened is that it was not always post. It is peri, just along with or just preceding, even before a fever starts, from the prodromal symptoms of the infection itself, the glomerulonephritis happening. And then the glomerulonephritis occurring along with the infection, and so on. So this post, peri, mid infectious course, collectively they put as kind of infection-related glomerulonephritis. Most often, the current terminology, the current clinical picture is that most often there is a concurrent infection going on along with glomerulonephritis. So this IRGN is a kind of a broader term which encompasses the whole lot of the temporal relationship between the infectious illness as well as the glomerular disease and so on. And this picture denotes the host of other organisms. There is a lot of focus now on the staphylococcus, not just streptococcus, the staphylococcus, and then the gram-negative rods and the mycobacteria and the chlamydia, viruses, and so on. So it's a very broad term. IRGN doesn't denote one particular organism. It also doesn't denote one particular, the timeline with relation to the temporal relationship of the infection and the glomerulonephritis. It's a very broad term, fine? Next slide. What is the pathogenesis? I want all your attention here, undistracted attention on this particular slide. I would like to dwell quite some time on this. You have to understand thoroughly this seminal observation. This is a very important article published in 2013 in Kidney International by Jai Radhakrishnan Sami Nazar group. It is one of the classical articles on this particular topic. See, how we were all taught in undergraduate, even as an MD postgraduate, I was taught that post-infectious glomerulonephritis is a prototype of immune complex glomerulonephritis. What is immune complex? An antigen, antibody with a complement component, a classical type 3 reaction. That's what we were taught. And if you see, in the past, most of the biopsies of the so-called post-infectious glomerulonephritis, first of all, we didn't have enough experience of looking at the kidney biopsies of the classical post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis because there was no indication for kidney biopsy in most of the children with this particular illness, because it used to be a kind of a very self-limiting disease without any specific therapy, supportive measures. Only thing we used to be worried about hypertension, because young children going in for a sudden rise in hypertension, they can go in for acute left ventricular failure as well as hypertensive encephalopathy. So we used to be extremely careful about the blood pressure. Beyond that, everything within a week or two, everything will settle down. Hardly there was any indication for biopsy. But the biopsy series of erstwhile post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis or post-infectious glomerulonephritis, if you see, you can see the presence of significant presence of antibodies, immunoglobulins. That's why it was, we were taught as a prototype of immune complex. But what is the current scenario? And the hypothesis and the pathomechanism that was described in the formation of immune complexes in the past, there was two mechanisms described, right? One is, please concentrate in the round, in the capillary lumen in 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock position first. What does it show? There is a deposition of circulating bacterial antigen antibody immune complexes, meaning bacterial antigen. There are some bacterial antigens for which antibodies are formed. Again, there are different mechanisms of antibody formation, of molecular mimicry, and so on. So antibodies are formed, and this antibody antigen complexes are in circulation, and they get trapped in the glomerulus. That is the initial hypothesis. But this hypothesis didn't attract many investigators because, you know, it's very difficult to explain the deposition of immune complexes in the subepithelial space. Presence of complexes in the subepithelial space is one of the hallmarks of the IgN. So it's very difficult to explain the immune complex circulating and traversing through the endothelium and basement membrane and then finding a place in the subepithelial space. So this particular mechanism didn't attract many investigators. Then very popular hypothesis that remained in vogue till recently. Please concentrate on the capillary lumen in the 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock position, right? There you can see here in situ bacterial antibody complex formation. What does it mean? That the bacterial antigens, they find their way, disrupts and enters into the subepithelial space, and then immune complexes are formed there in the glomerulus, and they find their way in the subepithelial space, and they get deposited. That is what is the explanation. But now the most important thing you have to concentrate is the capillary lumen on the 7 o'clock position here. What does it show? These first and second hypotheses, if they are true, if they are the mechanisms, you should give an explanation for absence of immunoglobulin in the immunofluorescence. Is it not? Is it not? If it is immune complex, where is the immunoglobulin? You say it's only C3, predominantly C3. That is why this hypothesis, the third hypothesis, please concentrate here. What's happening here is that the bacterial antigen, the small red circles, they are there. What do? They go and bind to plasmin. As you can see here, the little, the rectangular shapes in orange color, you know, they are the plasmin. It goes and binds to the plasmin and it causes activation of the plasmin. There is no immune complex here. No immune complex at all. So this is the mechanism. So what does this plasmin do? What does this plasmin do? Plasmin has got a capability to cause degradation of the matrix proteins of the glomerular basement membrane. That by itself can just be injurious to the GBM. It can cause disruption of the GBM. Not just that, it can invite the neutrophils and other monocytes and other inflammatory cells into the site. And the third most important mechanism is that this plasmin can cause complement activation. As you can see here, the black dots, which are there in the capillary lumen that is projected in the 5 o'clock position, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock position. As you can see here, the combination of the bacterial antigen, activated plasmin, and then complement attached to it. So this is what is the mechanism that is proposed now. There is no immune complex here. So can we still call it as a prototype of immune complex disease? There is a big question mark. There's a big question mark. It used to be the post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis of erstwhile PSGN of childhood. It was a prototype of immune complex disease, but now it is not so. This hypothesis explained the absence of immunoglobulin in the immunofluorescence and the predominant presence of complement. And this complement activation is through the alternate complement pathway, not the classical pathway, not the lectin pathway. It is the alternate pathway. Let me elaborate a little more on this in the next slide. Next slide, please. I request all the postgraduates who are listening to this lecture, please go through this latest article in International Journal of Molecular Sciences. I just got this beautiful, this is a beautiful article. See, what are the prototype antigen, protogenic putative antigens of the streptococcus we have learned. The two things are glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. You are all very well aware about this, no? Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, number 1, and number 2, streptococcal pyrogenic exotoxin. No, these are the classical, the prototypical putative nephrogenic antigens of the streptococcus. Now, what is this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase? It is not just unique to streptococcus, even though it is a classical presence in streptococcus. It was extracted from the cytoplasmic extraction of the streptococcus, but it is there in a host of so many other bacteria as well. It plays a very crucial role in the biology of the streptococcus. It is a kind of generally it is regarded as a kind of a housekeeping gene, but now very interesting to learn that it has got multiple other roles, multiple pleiotropic actions. Like it plays a role in the energy milieu of the organism. It takes part in glycolysis, it takes part in autophagy, and so on and so forth. But we are more interested in its capacity to bind to plasmin. That's what I was demonstrating, the bacterial antigen. So this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase goes and binds to the plasmin, which is there in the glomerular. Okay. So currently, this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase is termed as nephritis-associated plasmin receptor. It goes and binds to the plasmin. What happens then? Plasmin, which is there in the glomerulus, normally it is degraded by antiplasmins. So it has got a finite half-life. So nothing happens. Once this plasmin is bound by nephritis-associated plasmin receptor, NAPLR, which is otherwise glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, this plasmin gets stabilized. It gets activated. Then it does the whole lot of functions which I said. As you can see here, disruption of the GBM, exciting an inflammatory response, inviting the inflammatory cells to the site of injury, and then causing activation of complement. All that is being done. Now, next slide, please. Look at this slide. This is a beautiful slide. I'm so excited. See, now you can demonstrate this nephritis-associated plasmin receptor in the kidney biopsy by immunofluorescence. And the deposition of this nephritis-associated plasmin receptor and the corresponding plasmin activity both can be demonstrated by immunofluorescence, and this can serve as a kind of a biomarker for the infection-related glomerulonephritis. And again, I will tell you, even though this is classically for streptococcus, this nephritis-associated plasmin receptor can be there in certain other bacteria as well, right? So this is the exciting development of the current pathomechanism of IRGN. Next slide, please. So based on all this, this is what is the definition or the diagnostic criteria for IRGN. Saminasar group, Saminasar, Jay Radhakrishnan, and Vivek Agati. This group has done so much of contribution to the understanding of glomerulonephritis. Okay, there are a lot of seminal observations have come from this group, right? So these are the at least you need to have 3 out of these 5 criteria for making a diagnosis of IRGN. One is a documented infection, which can be an intercurrent infection, ongoing infection, or a previous infection, a preceding infection, and so on. Number 2, hypocomplementemia. And again, please remember, it may not be present in all the patients. There are explanations where in a given case, complement can be normal. There are explanations for that. So it's variable. Up to 70% of the patients will have hypocomplementemia, particularly the pathology where the pathology is DPGN. The hypocomplementemia is more common vis-a-vis just a mesangial proliferation, right? Then the third one is exudative endocapillary proliferation in the light microscopy. The 4th criterion, as I've already said, C3 dominant or co-dominant immunofluorescence, right? The 4th one, subepithelial hump-shaped deposits. And the thing is that most of the times, it is very difficult to demonstrate the subepithelial humps. There are explanations for that. If you delay the kidney biopsy, Usually, in IRGN, we don't do biopsy immediately. We wait for the spontaneous resolution. So if you delay by more than 2 weeks and so on, sometimes the subepithelial hump disappears. So absence of subepithelial hump does not rule out your IRGN. So out of these 5, 3 have to be there. That is the current diagnostic criteria. There are certain pitfalls, there are certain caveats in the current methodology as well, but compared to any other diagnostic classification, this is more worthwhile, and that's what we are following. Fine. So I just to illustrate that the current IRGN is not really innocuous, I'll share our own experience, our own publications. This is one of the important publications which we made, follow-up study of post-infectious glomerulonephritis in adults, analysis of predictors of poor renal outcome, and excerpts of this particular article are discussed in one of the NEFSAPs, which is a nephrology self-assessment program. They have at length they have discussed about, they have analyzed this particular article because in IRGN is a disease entity of the Eastern world, not the Western world. In this study, actually, the number of patients studied were 102. The study period was 2009 to 11. Mean duration of follow-up was 12 months. Range of 3 to 36 months. As you can note here, at 12 months, 11% had serum creatinine more than 1.5 milligram per deciliter.
Project the slide also. Slide is not coming.
Oh, yeah. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Fine. So at 12 months, 11% had serum creatinine more than 1.5 milligram per deciliter, and this is what is our observation. Next slide. Yeah. Please note here, in 2009 to 2011, 25% of these 100 and odd patients had even full house immunoglobulin deposition, not just C3 alone. Only 16% had C3 alone. Another 16% had dominant C3 with trace IgG. Only 32% for the current definition. The remaining 25% had even full house, and see another 20% had C3, IgG, IgM, and C1q, and so on. And even in that time, 2009 to 11, when we were not aware of the entity called IgA dominant IRGN, 4% of our patient series had IgA dominant, right? So there are a lot of ifs and buts. If you look into the immunofluorescence pattern, some of these patients may not fit into the current diagnosis of IRGN. That's what. So after this period, after 2011, most of the IRGN biopsies revealed only C3 or C3 dominance. This is a kind of a change in the pattern of the immunofluorescence in the same department. I'll just highlight on that subsequent slides. Next slide. So in the same study, we analyzed the correlates of poor renal outcome. Patients with age of more than 40 years and males, and serum creatinine more than 2 milligram per deciliter at 1 week after the onset of illness. Presence of comorbidities like diabetes, alcoholism, and so on. And the renal failure, severe renal failure warranting dialysis support. And the presence of crescents in more than 30% of the glomeruli. These were the correlates of poor outcome in that study. Next slide. The same department. Next slide. Yeah. Another study which was done on the same subject, 2016 to 17. This time it was 42 patients. Mean age was 42 years. About 14% of age more than 60 years, with a follow-up of about 38 weeks, median follow-up of 38 weeks. Next slide. So we applied the Sami-Naser criteria here. 55% of them had 3 out of 5, and 45% of them had 4 out of 5 criteria. And median follow-up was only 38 weeks. Next slide. Look at the immunofluorescence pattern. I have just put it for your comparative analysis. 45% of them had only C3, and 1/3, 33% had dominant C3 and trace IgG. Just compare that with the previous timeline. Okay, so the picture is right in front of our eyes. The picture has changed. This is what we are really excited about, right? Next slide. So this is the comparative analysis of IRGN published in different countries and our own publication, 2 publications and different timelines, right? The point of interest in our series is that in quite a good number of them, we were not able to identify the source of infection to the tune of about 40% in one study and 49%. And as you can see here, in the latest study, 2016 to 17, a significant number of them presented with severe renal failure, warranting dialysis initiation, right? And then as you can see here, the prognosis, poor prognosis, progression to CKD in as high as 40%, and even ESRD developing while on follow-up about 2.4%. And the source of infection, skin and subcutaneous tissues and upper respiratory tract in 35% and 7% respectively. So this is these are the differences between the classic PSGN and adult IRGN. You might wonder why this slide is in different color. So we are in constant touch with Jay Radhakrishnan on this particular topic. You know, this is his slide. He wanted this slide to be projected. So I don't change the format of this slide. It's Jay Radhakrishnan's slide in his own slide. Fine. See, the differences between the classic PSGN and adult IRGN. The incidence of classic PSGN is decreasing. Adult IRGN is increasing, number one. And the demographic profile, it's elderly with a male dominance. And but the pathogenesis is variable in adult IRGN. There it is the classical immune complex in classic PSGN. And as you can see here, the presence of hypertension, presence of renal failure, volume overload, everything is high in adult IRGN. And the site of infection, usually either it is upper respiratory tract or skin in the classic PSGN. Here, you have to have a very diligent search for infection head to foot. Everywhere, any infection can be associated. It can be lung infection, urinary tract infection, bone infection, visceral infection, even infective endocarditis, and so on and so forth. Unlike the classical nephrogenic strains afflicting the respiratory tract and the skin. So this is an important difference. We'll discuss in subsequent slides more on this. And the whole lot of organisms, not just group A Streptococcus. And the risk factors in the current IRGN, both for occurrence of IRGN as well as for the worst outcome, is diabetes, alcoholism, and malignancy, and with a poor prognosis. So this is the difference. So one more term, you should not get confused with the different terminologies. Sanjeev Sethi, another legendary pathologist who has contributed significantly, he only uses the term atypical post-infectious glomerulonephritis. What is that? The classical IRGN picture, the post-infectious glomerulonephritis picture, where you are not able to identify the source of infection. He calls it as atypical, but no other major investigator of this area, I mean, this topic uses this, but still, just to keep you familiarized with the different terminologies, I'm just projecting this slide. Now here comes the real tricky situation, very difficult situation. How to differentiate a kind of a IRGN from C3GN? We'll discuss that later. Why? Because the light microscopy in C3GN, even though classically it is MPGN pattern, but it is not always that. You can have a DPGN pattern. You can even have a mesangial proliferative glomerulonephritis pattern. It need not always be MPGN pattern. So that is number one. Number two, immunofluorescence in C3GN, it is just C3 alone or C3 dominance. When there is another presence of another immunoreactant, the C3 has to be at least 2 grades more than any other immune reactant. That's it. So the same thing here in IRGN as well. So the only differentiating feature can be electron microscopy. But again, I'll tell you, electron microscopy, the presence of subepithelial humps in abundance is more towards IRGN, but that does not confirm. You can have infrequent subepithelial deposits in C3GN as well. And you can have subendothelial deposits in IRGN as well. So that is not really discriminating. But one thing is that if there is plenty of lots and lots of subepithelial humps, that's more in terms of IRGN. So practically how to differentiate? Practically how to differentiate is the fact that what do we do? Generally, it is accepted. We may be right or we may be wrong, but generally, very arbitrarily, all the investigators are working on these areas. They follow one pattern. There will be hypocomplementemia to start with. And in a pure classical IRGN, the hypocomplementemia resolves If there is persistent hypocomplementemia beyond 12 weeks, by and large, you are dealing with C3G. This is what we can think of. One more thing also I'll tell you. Presence of infection preceding the glomerulonephritis again does not confirm IRGN, because there are any number of instances an infection triggers C3GN. So that also does not stick. Actually, one slide is missing. I mean, when I sent the slides across, I just forgot to send one important slide. One of the recent publications in JASN in 2020, the presence detection of anti-factor B antibodies. One group they have identified, they analyze the presence based on this presence of this anti-factor B antibodies. They try to differentiate between IRGN and C3GN. 91% of the patients in that cohort tested positive. Of the IRGN patients tested positive for the antibody. 91% of IRGN patients had anti-factor B antibodies, whereas only 14% of the C3GN patients had positivity of anti-factor B antibodies. This is very interesting. So it shows that anti-factor B antibody causing alternate complement pathway activation, but it is not persistent. It vanishes over a period of time. That's why it is IRGN. So this is a kind of, I mean, even though it does not clearly differentiate between these two, a strong presence of anti-factor B antibody during acute illness indicates more towards IRGN. So that is one recent observation. Next slide, please. Let me move on to another publication of ours. The previous slide, just the slide before. Yeah. Let me move on to various presentations of this IRGN. So far, we have discussed about the classical IRGN. Now, there are other variants. A crescentic infection-related glomerulonephritis and in adults and its outcome. This is yet another publication of ours. Next slide. It's a retrospective observation study of 194 IRGN patients, out of whom 47 had presence of they satisfied the diagnosis criteria of crescentic IRGN, meaning more than 50% of the glomeruli should have more than 50% of the crescent involvement. That's what we define. So 47, that is 24%, roughly 1/4 of them had crescentic IRGN. Why we wanted to study as a subgroup here, this particular investigation is that the outcome was pretty poor in this. The mean age was 42 years, and we followed mean follow-up of the study cohort was about 10 months. As you can see here, 87% of the hypertension, and more than 3/4 of them are present with rapidly progressive renal failure. Very significant finding. 1/3 of them tested positive for MRSA. So more of staphylococcus here. The commonest site of infection was skin, and more than 50% of them required dialysis support. And complete recovery was there in only 1/4. The 3/4 had poor outcome, either progression to CKD and subsequently ESRD, and then mortality to the tune of about 19%. A point of interest here is that since we came across crescentic IRGN, wherever there was infection, along with broad spectrum antibiotic or after treating with antibiotics, when the disease was not resolving, we went ahead giving steroids. As 78% of the patients received steroids. Next slide. So this is the bacteriology of the crescentic IRGN, MRSA, then Streptococcus and Enterococcus, Klebsiella, small group, E. coli, Pseudomonas, and about 50% of them, the organism was not clear. Next slide. What are the correlates of poor outcome in this? Presence of MRSA and presence of interstitial fibrosis in biopsy and the dialysis requirement at presentation. All these were significant poor prognostic factors in this cohort, and steroid therapy didn't make any difference in terms of outcome. A point of interest here is that whenever you brand somebody as crescentic IRGN, please ask yourself, are you not missing a vasculitis? Are you not missing a vasculitis? That's very important. Okay, a crescentic IRGN. Of course, in vasculitis, you don't get a classical proliferative pathology, more of necrotizing pathology, but still you have to have an index of suspicion because only C3 presents. Only point of difference, differentiating feature will be hypocomplementemia, which is not a feature of onco disease, because thinking that it is a crescentic IRGN just because there was an infection preceding this illness, and if you miss a diagnosis of onco, you'll pay a very heavy price. So think twice before you handle, we brand somebody as crescentic IRGN, the prognosis is very poor. Next slide. Then this IRGN, does it spare a renal allograft? No, we had experience of IRGN in renal allograft as well, which again has got a poor prognosis. Next slide. This is our patient, a 28-year-old gentleman. Basic disease was a reflux nephropathy, and the father was a donor. He was on triple immunosuppression. Actually, there was one mild acute cellular rejection at 2 years post transplant and then resolved. 6th year post transplant, he developed multiple impetiginous lesions, went in for IRGN, hypocomplementemia, elevated ASO. We gave methylprednisolone pulses and dialysis. No recovery, graft was lost. You can see the subepithelial humps in this patient, in this picture which we are projected. Next slide. So far in the literature, there are only 14 case reports of IRGN in renal allograft recipients. 6 out of them presented with severe renal failure, warranting dialysis, mortality 1, partial recovery 6, complete recovery only 1 out of 14. That's why I say IRGN in a renal transplant recipient, we are really scared. No, the prognosis is poor. Next slide. Let me move on to another important variant, that is IgA dominant IRGN. This again is a relatively newer entity, less than 10 years ago, right? In classical IRGN, we have only C3 or trace IgG. In IgA dominant IRGN, IgA is the sole or dominant immunoglobulin. Usually it afflicts elderly, diabetes, and staphylococcal infection. To start with, people termed it as a kind of staphylococcal nephritis, staphylococcal glomerulonephritis, because association between staphylococcus and IgA dominant IRGN is pretty high. So they thought, but now in our own experience, it's not always staphylococcus. I'll discuss that. Very high association with staphylococcus, but doesn't mean that it's only staphylococcus that causes IgA dominance. So this is what this is my perception. This is my own slide here. Actually, I consider it as a kind of a hybrid disease. It borrows some phenomena of IgA nephropathy and some phenomena of IRGA. Okay, the dominant presence of IgA is that, and then all other phenomena like hypocomplementemia and then proliferative pathology and so on, that is of IRGA. So it's a kind of a hybrid disease. It shares the phenomena of both the diseases, right? It's very, very exciting and a very intriguing disease. This is what is the characteristic phenomena of IgA nephropathy. The clinical features, as I've already said, predominantly staphylococcal infection, hypocomplementemia, which is not a feature of IgA nephropathy. That is an important differentiating feature. And presentation in older age, whereas classical IgA nephropathy, by and large, we get in relatively younger age, and more common in diabetes, and presentation in itself with acute renal failure, insufficiency, and pathological phenomena, the subepithelial humps and electron microscopy, strong staining for C3 than IgA here. Even though it is dominant immunoglobulin, C3 also is very strongly present here, which is not a phenomenon in classical IgA nephropathy. That is a differentiating feature. Fine. Why this particular disease entity? Why such a severe presentation? Why it afflicts people with diabetes and other comorbidities and so on? So another exciting pathophysiology here. The role of superantigen. You all might have heard about superantigen. What is the superantigen? The classical example is the staphylococcal enterotoxin. What is so super about it? So on the left-hand side of this picture, as you can see here, the antigen presenting cell and interacting with the T cell there. No, the classical synapse here. The antigen is endocytosed by the antigen presenting cell, processed into oligonucleotides and presented to the T cell on the groove of the APC formed by the MHC molecules. And this then activation happens when the co-stimulatory molecules also getting engaged, the respective co-stimulatory molecules on either end. This is a classical antigen presentation and the immunological activation. Look at the picture on the right-hand side, the superantigen. It behaves like a rowdy, no? It doesn't follow any of these patterns. So the superantigen is there on the other side. It directly attaches itself to the T cell, directly binds to the MHC class II molecules as well as the beta chain of the T cell receptor. So because of this kind of phenomenon, what happens is that very tremendous activation of the T cells, non-specific and tremendous, very huge, formidable activation of the T cells. Normally, when the antigens are presented in the normal format, the activation is 0.01 to 0.001 to 0.01% of the T cells only get activated. But here, 20% of the T cells get activated. The result is a terrific pathophysiology here. This is what is the mechanism of cephalococcal scalded skin syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis. All these have poor prognosis because of this phenomenon, the tremendous activation. The same thing is implicated here in IgA dominant. Naturally, the prognosis will be poor and the clinical picture will be poor. Okay. Release of numerous injury. Next slide, please. Numerous injurious cytokines and polyclonal antibody production. And some of these cytokines result in class switch. That is why you get IgA dominance. That is what currently we believe. Okay, next slide. This is what our experience of IgA dominant infection-related glomerulonephritis in India. It's one of the large series from India is ours. These are the phenomena of our series. The study is over a period of 4.5 years. Out of 230 patients of IRGN during this study period, 12% had IgA dominant IRGN. Sorry, 5%. 12 patients had and 5% had IgA dominant IRGN. Next slide. The most common site of infection. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, the most common site of infection was skin. Most of them presented as rapidly progressive renal failure, and significant number of them had hypocomplementemia. But the point of interest here is that in our series, not everybody was diabetic, and not every patient had staphylococcus. So that is the unique features of our series. And look at the outcome. Recovery only in 25%. 25% went in for CKD, 25 progressed to ESRD, and 25 mortality. Okay, and those who recovered also, it was not a complete recovery. Some element of hypertension and proteinuria was noted, even those who recovered. So it's not a complete recovery. So overall, the prognosis is very, very poor. Next slide. So this is our experience of 12 patients. As you can see here, just concentrate on the organisms. After comorbidity, you have the organism. Not every patient had staphylococcus. As you can see here, some of them had E. coli, and a couple of them even had Klebsiella, right? That's it. So this depicts the comorbidities, see alcoholism, and even leprosy. One of the patients had leprosy and lepra reaction, and then IRGN that turned out to be IgA dominant. So very varied presentation. So at least 50% of them had Staphylococcus aureus, and other organisms also are noted. Next slide. So this is a comparative analysis of the published IgA dominant IRGN across the world, published comparative analysis. Very few centers have come up with this. As you can, the last row, as you can see here, every series shows significant number of them going in for CKD and progression to ESRD. So that's what about IgA dominant IRGN. Next slide. So these are very exciting questions which we have about IgA nephropathy and IgA dominant IRGN. Whether these two diseases represent different facets of the same pathophysiology. That's what is the big pondering question. Why? Because there has been demonstration of anti-Staph aureus IgA1 and IgA2 antibodies in patients with both IgA nephropathy and IgA dominant IRGN by certain investigators, right? Then the probable adhesin, it is the antigen, the putative antigen, a cell membrane antigen of the Staph aureus, which has been demonstrated in the glomeruli of patients with both IgA nephropathy as well as IgA dominant IRGN. Okay. So these two factors make us ponder over the hypothesis whether there is a linkage between IgA nephropathy and IgA dominant IRGN. Okay. Only thing is that still there is not enough experience published in the literature on the type and the composition of IgA that is deposited in IgA dominant IRGN, about which we know very well in classical IgA nephropathy, the kind of the IgA that is deposited. So that may kind of clarify further. Next slide. Fine. Now we move on to what, having understood what this disease is all about, how to treat it. That is a big question. So IgA dominant IRGN and overall IRGN in adults, everything has got a very poor prognosis. And does immunosuppression have a role apart from treatment of the infection? That is a big $1 million question. Okay. We believe that infection is only the trigger and the renal disease is immune mediated. Even though we know it is not immune complex, it is a complement activation. Some kind of an element of immunity, pathomechanism is there. But always we are worried, no, there can be a hidden focus of infection that may get exacerbated with immunosuppressive therapy. And there are varying outcomes in anecdotal reports. There are not many published series. If at all, there are only anecdotal experiences with very few number of patients, and most of them are uncontrolled trials. So naturally, there is no guideline yet. So the only way to find an answer is a randomized controlled trial. There is no randomized controlled trial on the role of immunosuppression in IRGN so far. So we went ahead doing an RCT on this. I think we are the first one in the world literature. Shortly, we are publishing our data. This is how we went ahead. So the IRGN, based on the clinical presentation, history, and laboratory investigations, and serology, and kidney biopsy, and so on, applying the diagnostic criteria by Sami Nasser, inclusion criteria, adults more than 18 years old, and peak serum creatinine at least 1.5 milligram per deciliter. And exclusion criteria, active focus of infection, HIV, hepatitis B and C associated, IRGNs, and then persistent hypocomplementemia more than 3 months. This is C3GN. So as I've already said, any person having hypocomplementemia more than 12 weeks, C3GN, so such patients will be excluded. Then IgA dominant IRGN, we never included in this because we thought, it's an entirely different cohort. Underlying diabetic glomerular sclerosis, and if the pathology shows chronicity of more than 40%. There is one catch here. The persistent hypocomplementemia more than 3 months, meaning 12 weeks. So you mean to say that you will be waiting till 12 weeks to randomize the patient into this trial? That is a big question mark, is it not? So will it not be too late? So what we did is that, we just applied all the exclusion, other exclusion criteria, and some of them, after getting consent, we included, and then with an idea and intention that if the hypocomplementemia persisted beyond 12 weeks, we withdraw. But fortunately, none of our patients had this kind of a problem. So whomsoever, based on all other exclusion criteria, we excluded and included, they stuck on to this. Okay, this is one practical challenge. Okay, it was a block randomization, and 2 arms, steroid arm and non-steroid arm. Next slide. In steroid arm, standard of care is infection eradication, fluid and salt restriction, antihypertensives, dialysis support as and when required. Steroid arm, in addition to the standard of care, IV methylprednisolone 500 milligram on 3 consecutive days, followed by oral prednisone 1 milligram per kg per day for about a month, which will be tapered over a period of time, over a period of 3 months, along with hydroxyzole prophylaxis and standard treatment. So this is what we went ahead. Next slide. The primary outcome of the study. Next slide. No, the previous slide. Previous slide. Yeah, the primary outcome of the trial was serum creatinine should come down to less than 1.5 milligram per deciliter at 6 months from the time of randomization, or during the last follow-up if duration of follow-up is less than 6 months. This is the primary outcome. Secondary outcomes were death or dialysis requiring renal failure at 6 months, persistent proteinuria at 6 months, dialysis is independent at any point of among the patients who were dialysis dependent at presentation. So these are the secondary outcomes. Next slide. Yeah. So we screened about 118 patients, and 52 patients were randomized, and 39 patients have completed 6 months follow-up. The interim analysis was done when 32 patients had completed 6 months. Unfortunately, no difference in primary outcome or any of the secondary outcomes between the 2 arms. So as of now, we are not in a position to advocate steroids, but still we are continuing the study. Shortly we'll come up with our own publication on this. Next slide. The most important point which we learned the entire saga of our experience with IRGN is that the single most important crucial step in the management is that very diligent search for focus of infection. This we have learned so much after application of our minds on this particular point. In the past, we'll be just examining the entire body for any cutaneous infection and throat swab and looking at the upper respiratory tract and so on. Now we know ENT evaluation as a routine. We send to ENT specialist for a complete examination. There is an instance, a very interesting anecdote. In fact, I thought that also I'll put as a case report. As a case vignette here. But time may not permit. Actually, there was a patient where there was subclinical presence of mastoiditis that they found out, and there was an ongoing glomerulonephritis. And then we went ahead doing a mastectomy. And there was a resolution of the glomerulonephritis. So it was a huge learning point for us. So, and then dental evaluation, the periodontitis, very important. It will be just asymptomatic. So you need to, so we used to get a dental opinion, we used to get an ENT opinion and do an echocardiography. We can pick up sometimes the vegetation and so on. Whenever there is a crescentic nephritis, in fact, endocarditis presentation is most often it presents as crescentic nephritis. That point also I wanted to impress upon. And then the complete dermatology evaluation, chest X-ray, lung infection, and complete ultrasound screening of the entire abdomen for any visceral infection. Sometimes it is subclinical, not very obvious clinically and so on. And blood and urine culture, pus wherever it is there and so on. So the diligent search of infection is very, very important. Next slide. So let me conclude saying that the so-called PIGN, IRGN is no longer just a disease of children. And no longer it is an innocuous entity. CKD progression is increasingly reported. Lots and lots of atypical variants are there. And more of C3 dominance or C3 alone. In the same region, the same department itself, experience is changing. And there is persistent hypercomplementemia is more and more reported. And IgA dominant variant also is increasing incidence. So all these points make me wonder, are we dealing with, under the term IRGN, are we dealing with a single disease? Or unfortunately, out of our ignorance, we are just branding so many other diseases as IRGN. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Gopalakrishnan. Wonderful talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And though you exceeded time, but I kept quiet because I was enjoying the talk. And I think students were also enjoying the talk. You have totally threadbare spoken about the subject right from beginning, that today it is a different era. Post-streptoglomerulonephritis, post-streptococcal is going away, are becoming less, and infection-related glomerulonephritis, which is the correct terminology today, is becoming dominant. You have given the different ways it can present, clinically, generally nephritic presentation, or it can be rapidly progressive renal failure. You mentioned to students that the investigative approach will be that there is hypocomplementemia. For diagnosis, if we go to the criteria given by Dr. Radhakrishnan from Columbia, you have to have 3 out of 5 criteria, and for that, renal biopsy becomes mandatory. Because the 3 criteria out of 5, that is exudative lesions, C3 deposition, and subepithelial humps, will come only from biopsy. So biopsy becomes an important criteria for diagnosis. And again, you have mentioned that in biopsy, though endocapillary lesion is a dominant lesion, but it can be simple mesangial, it can be crescentic also. And you also mentioned that it is an infection where the deposition can be of IgA, IgG, IgM, polyclonal. And sometimes there's a dominant IgA, sometimes there's a dominant crescentic lesion. And rightly you put it in the end, are we dealing with a single disease or a different entities? But unfortunately, as you rightly brought out, at the moment, except for treating infection, we do not have any definitive treatment, just a supportive treatment. So I'll again say one point again, that we have to look for infection. Whenever we are suspecting a patient presenting acute nephritic presentation, look for infection, as very vividly brought out by a lot of work by Dr. Gopalakrishnan, his own work, that almost 40% of the times they were not able to find an infection. That is a problem. And at that point of time, it becomes difficult to pinpoint the lesion. I don't think there are many questions from the students, but you have already covered, but one of the questions came as how to differentiate from C3 glomerulonephritis. You have already brought out, but will you like to mention again a word about that?
It's a very tricky situation. Most of the times we will not be able to. Only thing is that, the persistent hypocomplementemia beyond 12 weeks. That's it. But this distinction is very, very important for two reasons. One, if you make a diagnosis of C3GN, your diagnostic workup should include looking for paraproteinemia, particularly in elderly, number one. Number two, in the past, we were not treating with any specific therapy for C3GN. Now it has changed after this Glozan experience from Spain, Spanish study. You have to initiate a combination of steroid plus MMF. You make a difference in C3GN. So on these two counts, your laboratory workup is different if you make a diagnosis of C3GN, as well as your therapy has been different. So this distinction is important. And unfortunately, right now we don't have much of differentiating phenomena. As I've already said, if there is an obvious source of infection and there are plenty of subepithelial humps in the subepithelial space in electron microscopy, it is more in terms of IRGN. Whereas persistent hypocomplementemia beyond 12 weeks with the same clinical picture, it is almost certain that you are dealing with C3GN. So that's it.
There is another question.
And I said, no, that is all. I attached the significance of recent publication, JASN, looking for the presence of anti-factor B antibodies. Its presence is very high in IRGN, whereas only a very small fraction of C3GN have it. So absence of anti-factor B antibody in the acute phase of illness, less than 2 weeks after the onset, more towards C3GN.
There's another question which is coming. The student is asking, can you throw some light on the life cycle of IRGN? Which is the first deposit to appear and which is the first deposit to disappear?
The acute nephrotic syndrome, meaning the clinical phenomena. I understand the question that the clinical and laboratory phenomena.
No, possibly he was wanting which.
Yeah, it is a classical acute nephrotic syndrome. It is an edema, hypertension, azotemia, proteinuria, usually subnephrotic and microhematuria. To start with, in the classical IRGN, those days of erstwhile IRGN where the prognosis is good, the clinical resolution will happen first, that is edema, and then hypertension, azotemia, then proteinuria, and the last one to disappear is microscopic hematuria.
Yeah, and one must remember that microscopic hematuria and proteinuria can last 1 month together.
That is the Baldwin's experience. The Baldwin is one who who investigated in early 1970s and so
on. Will you mention again a word about nephritis associated plasmin receptor, that is a plasmin activity? Is the staining easily available?
No, it is the latest one. It is just, it is yet to become into a reality.
Yeah, that will be a
molecule. I'm so excited. I think in no time it will be available.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The technique is not very great. It's only same immunofluorescence. Antibody tagged with fluorescent. Only thing, the reagent has to be made available. I was really excited. I learned this one day last week.
Okay, because once this antibody is available, the diagnosis will become easier. Any other question from student?
Yes, sir. There is a question in the chat box. This is from Dr. Sandeep Singhal. How to proceed in management when we are in doubt between C3GN and IRGN? So again, sir.
What I would suggest is that when you are not able to, when you are thinking more in favor of C3GN, number one, as well as in crescentic glomerulonephritis, what we do is that we diligently look for the presence of focus of infection, eradicate and treat the infection, and along with broad spectrum antibiotic, if in case you are not able to detect an antibiotic, focus of infection, along with a broad spectrum antibiotic, go ahead starting with the steroid and MMF if you think in terms of C3GN, because time is gold over there.
Yeah.
Because currently the Spanish experience, the Glozan series, clearly shows that the cohort who received the combination of steroid and MMF early of this makes a lot of difference in the prognosis. And after 12 weeks, if the hypocomplementemia is persistent, you are very certain that it is only C3GN.
Can we say that, Dr. Gopal, that anybody having atypical presentation, whether it is crescentic, whether it is an IgA dominant, are going to have a poor prognosis?
Please say it. Pardon me, sir. I mean, your voice is breaking.
I
Please
was
repeat.
saying, can we tell the students that any patient with infection-related glomerulonephritis who has got atypical presentation, atypical means like crescentic lesion or IgA dominant lesion, that they are going to have a bad prognosis?
Certainly, that's what is our experience. Certainly.
And what is the pathogenesis of normocomplementemic glomerulonephritis?
It's very difficult to answer this question because, you know, like if you apply the same mechanism of plasmin mediated disease, it all depends on how much of complement activation happens with plasmin. See,
and logically, at what point of time complement has been estimated?
If it is immune complex mediated, certainly there will be hypocomplementemia. But if it is only plasmin mediated, the plasmin can inflict the glomerulonephritis by multiple mechanisms without involving complement also in a small fraction of the patients, without involving complement, that by itself can cause disruption of the glomerular basement membrane and initiate inflammatory reaction. But by and large, it causes activation of complement as well. That's why you get a hypocomplementemia. So this plasmin thing we can describe, can discuss, can explain, can answer the normocomplementemic IRGN as well.
Can students go with the message now that when we talk of the pathogenesis or mechanism of injury, it is primarily plasmin related? The old concept that it is due to a bacterial antigen there, are the immune complexes going there, are the planted antigen against which antibodies are forming in C2, are those still holding time? Or we say it is plasmin related today?
All the old concepts are getting pushed aside. But still we do get the classical post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis in children where the mechanism is the old hypothesis of immune complex mediated. But the current ones are, I think, more, we are tempted to think more in terms of the bacterial antigen. That is what is your plasmin nephritis associated plasmin, nothing but glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, which is a component of the bacterium that stabilizes plasmin and plasmin mediated injury. We are tempted to believe this mechanism because based on our experience and clinical presentation and so on.
Can we now say finally that it is very important whenever a patient is presenting with the acute nephritic syndrome or a rapidly progressive renal failure, one must meticulously look for underlying infection, which may be hidden right from dental caries to somewhere else. And every effort should be made to identify that, because at the moment, the treatment for that will logically remain the treatment for infection. Rest of the mechanisms will be how it occurs is different, but we must identify the infection and treat that. Will that say that?
Exactly, sir. And we need to have a checklist. Referral to ENT, referral to dermatologist, and referral to dentist, then ultrasound abdomen, X-ray chest, all cultures, and not to miss echocardiogram as well. There can be silent vegetation sitting.
The last question I'll ask, that since you have got extensive work on that, we say that based on what is a complement deficiency, that can we make a suspicion, something like if there is let's say IgM deposition on biopsy, can we say possibly it is hinting towards shunt nephritis? If we have predominant C4 depression, can we say it is pointing to shunt nephritis? Something like that based on the complements?
Actually, C4 and C1q, we are not supposed to get in a classical IRGN, because in the complement pathways that is activated in IRGN is alternate complement pathway. So it's unlikely that we'll have a C4, which is a component of the classical pathway. So here more and more of alternate pathway. So that's it. And also recently Sanjeev Sethi has studied on the role of C4D staining to differentiate between the different glomerulonephritis. C4D, which we very widely use in analyzing the allograft pathology, is the same technique is used here. C4D deposition is there means, it indicates whether there is a classical pathway activation or lectin pathway. So which is not a phenomenon of C3GN. So if he has in his work he has demonstrated the presence of significant amount of C4D in immune complex type of proliferative glomerulonephritis, whereas C4D is less presence is less in IRGN, very small fraction, not at all in C3GN.
The last question I think somebody has just put up. Can we say no C3 deposition on immunofluorescence means no IRGN?
Yes.
I think we stop here. First of all, I must compliment Professor Gopalakrishnan for an excellent talk. The talk became more delicious because he gave his personal wide experience of different mechanism, crescentic, post-transplant cases. So that is always when you are giving your personal experience, you are master of the subject. Secondly, I think students have understood that infection-related glomerulonephritis, the present terminology, is not a benign disease, and we must look for the underlying causes, because the outcome of these diseases, because these are occurring in older population, they are occurring in patients who have got comorbidities, the outcome is bad, and a lot of patients go to ESRD or chronic kidney disease or a bad failure. So I think we stop here. We go back to the home, that keep in mind that if we are getting infection-related glomerulonephritis, look for infection and identify. I hand over to Dr. Kajal Shilpi for the final comments.
Thank you so much, sir, for the kind words. And we sincerely thank Professor Verma for a lovely moderation and his valuable insights and inputs. And also we sincerely thank and we are very grateful to Professor Gopalakrishnan sir. In spite of the cyclone, he joined us and gave a very excellent talk on this particular topic. Thank you again, sir. Also, thanks to all the attendees who joined us for today's session. Our next session is on 4th of December, and the topic will be on optimization of peritoneal dialysis prescription. That will be again from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. So we can share these details with your peer group as well, and we'll be soon contacting you with the technical details of this meeting. Thank you again, and have a good evening. Good evening ahead. Be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.